It's Thursday, which means we are presenting another EdTech collective event, Canvas and Instructure live stream with our good friends and partners, Harmonize by 42 Lines, taking discussions further to talk a little bit about the federal RSI guidelines and how to monitor engagement with Harmonize. I am joined by my good friend, Marcus, who is the CEO and founder of Harmonize by 42 Lines. Super excited everybody's joining us. As always, make sure you share, like, retweet, do all of the things, comment, send us your questions through all of these platforms as you're watching the live stream today. And if anybody out there is really kind of struggling with what RSI is and how you can monitor engagement in the classroom, with Harmonize and Canvas as an Instructure partner here, we can't wait to show you. And I know Marcus has a fantastic presentation teed up. We're so excited. I know that I have no idea what RSI is. I'm going to share that up front. So I'm super excited to learn alongside. I think one of the best ways that I think the best thing for me anyways, doing these live streams is to find out all of the things that I never knew in education that I probably should have at some point when I was in the classroom. Marcus, thanks so much for joining us.
No problem. And it totally makes sense that you don't know about this because it's relatively new.
And well, that's why.
And frankly, often federal guidelines are kind of dull and boring, and so people don't know about them. But this one I actually like, and I think it can be interesting. So hopefully I will manage to do that in the presentation.
Yeah, you know what? I think you're right. I think there is part of me as an educator or teacher, and a lot of folks that are probably watching that say, if it's not in there, like a lot of these government regulations and things that come down are always happening at like a district level, right? We have a curriculum director, or we have a superintendent, or somebody else is in charge of that. So we kind of keep our hands off. So I'm excited to hear more about how this can work both in the classroom and also for those that are kind of tracking those guidelines. But again, thanks for joining us. I'm going to get out of the way as always and let you do your thing. Marcus, thanks so much for being here.
All right, no worries. Yeah, and so I'm going to talk about the federal guidelines only in so much as how they relate to good online education, because that's what RSI is. So I'll dive into the definition a little bit. I'll get into ways to sort of actively do that in the classroom and some of the things that are a little more difficult. I'll do that in context of how we deal with it at Harmonize, but I'm going to try to keep this a little more general so that it can have value even if you're not using Harmonize. Of course, I would love you to be using Harmonize, but I'm hoping that you'll take value away from this regardless of whether you're currently a user or not. So I'm going to start with who I am, so you have a little bit of background. You can know where I'm coming from. I am the CEO and one of the founders of 42 Lines, and we are entirely focused on education technology in the higher education space, specifically like how do we make classrooms more engaging? How do we make online education more engaging? Like how do we elevate asynchronous discussions to the next level? How do we enable multiple person chat? How do we do Q&A forums? How do we do anything where we can meet that student where they're at so that they're communicating well with the classroom, with their peers, with the instructors, kind of removing that isolation side that can often happen in online education. So my background has been in EdTech for a long time. I tried to become a teacher, and kudos to all you teachers out there because it is hard. And I decided after 6 months that was not for me. Came back into technology and then focused on education inside of technology. So I talked a little bit about what Harmonize is, but I'll get into it briefly here so you can understand why these guidelines that I'm going to go over are so important. We are all about communication in the classroom. How do you interact with your students? How do students interact with each other? What does student engagement look like? So we build all kinds of tools that an instructor can then use to make their classroom easier to use for them and the students, more like what they're accustomed to on the internet. And that's what the guidelines that I'm going to go over today are really talking about. It's finally the federal government stepping in and say, hey, in online education, you need interaction with your students and you need it on a regular basis. So what RSI stands for is regular and substantive interaction. And that's a mouthful, and I hate the word substantive, but it's too hard to say. But let's get into what that actually means practically for you as an instructor. So substantive interaction, like that sounds like a mouthful, but really just means, are you interacting with your students? And what the feds have done is that they had pulled a huge panel together, and they're like, what does substantive interaction mean? And if you are out there doing online education, like, what do you have to be doing to check this box? And it breaks down into a pretty simple set of things that I'll cover. They say you have to be doing at least 2 of the following things. You have to be doing direct instruction. You have to be giving feedback to the students. You have to be responding to their questions. You have to be facilitating a group discussion. Um, and and that's how they define that. So I'm going to dive into that a little bit, some good strategies for that. But then we'll get into, I think, the more complicated part of things of what does regular mean? And they also have a monitoring component for needing to monitoring student engagement. So I'm going to pause for a second and say that this is not legal advice, because this does have specifically for higher education, accreditation, possibly financial aid, things that will have an impact. I am no lawyer. I am here to talk to the instructors, and practically, how can you make sure you're doing the right thing? It's up to you and your institution to figure out the legality of this. So please don't quote me if you're ever in a legal discussion as we're going along. All right. So how do we do this? How do we talk about it without just having a complete boring meltdown of I'm an instructor, I'm busy, and you're putting one more federal guideline on me? And the good news is I don't think it's that difficult. So if we can get past the fact that it is a federal guideline and it has a bunch of really lengthy language in it, then we can move ahead into what it actually means. All right. So direct instruction. In a remote world, I mean, in a classroom, that's great. You can go in person, but in COVID world or in online education, that often means you're using Zoom or you're using, Teams or anything along those lines. So anytime you're actually lecturing the students or in a discussion with the students synchronously, that is direct instruction. That is something I think that a lot of online classes have, and is probably the most common thing that's out there. So it's the easiest thing if you're looking to check 2 of the boxes to do. However, something that we've been beating the drums on a lot is, like, if you're just relying on synchronous education, that's not really super great. It leaves some people behind from an equity perspective, either because of bandwidth or because of they just can't participate on the fly when they're in a classroom full of people in Zoom. And so, how do you provide that direct instruction, but also keep it, accessible and equitable? And one of the strategies that we like to say before we dive past direct instruction is that make sure that if you are doing your synchronous discussions, make sure you pull that back into your asynchronous discussions, into whatever platform you're using. We at Harmonize actually do integration with the meeting platform, so you can schedule the meeting. We recommend putting a prompt out there to start with, to say, hey, this is what we're going to talk about. Here's a little pre-work you can do, and then let's get together in a synchronous session. And then when you're done, take those recordings and stick them back into the discussion. And when I say that the RSI guidelines are simple, that thing that I just described to you covers 2 of the bullet points, which is all you actually have to cover. So you could do direct participation, teaching direct instruction, teaching in the Zoom classroom, and you can facilitate a discussion that leads into that synchronous session and continues after the synchronous session, so that you actually have constant interaction going on. And that actually makes your synchronous session better, because they've done a little bit of pre-work, and those learners who maybe didn't make it, or those learners who have ideas after the fact, or even if you want to tie it into a homework assignment, they're back into a discussion that you can facilitate. So that's when I say it's easy, I'm saying there's some easy paths through. That's not the only path that you can take, but it's definitely an easy path to be able to take. So moving on from there, talking about facilitating group discussions. So how do you do that? What does it mean to facilitate a group discussion? How much do you have to be there? And a big part of this guideline is talking about making sure that what you're doing is predictable for the students. Regular, when they say regular, they mean scheduled, predictable, so that the students actually know when they're supposed to be in class, when they're supposed to be interacting. And that's something we like to talk about a lot when we talk about facilitating group discussions. So one of the things we recommend people do is actually set up very clear deadlines and due dates for any group facilitation that they're going to do. We at Harmonize actually have a way to set up multiple due dates. So it's not just like the topic starts and I'm going to set a due date for when it's due, and then everyone comes in a minute before the due date and chimes in with their work. We actually recommend breaking that up into multiple segments to say, hey, it's due Friday, but by Monday, come in and make a post. By Wednesday, come in and make 3 comments and on other people's posts, sort of to prime that pump, pull that content away from the deadline, and then you as the instructor have a much easier job facilitating that discussion because there's content there. You can actually reference it. You can tag other students and pull them into the conversation. And we lay that out visually for the student so they can see it in terms of that the student has to know when they're going to be there. But you can accomplish the same thing with just some really clear communication and announcements. So that's facilitating group discussions. I want to get into a couple more points on how to manage this interaction before we get into the harder part, which is the monitoring of the engagement. So pretty straightforward. Assessing or providing feedback was one of the bullet points. Most of you probably do this already, right? You give grades. When you're giving the grade, you put in a comment of some sort, or hopefully you use a rubric. And it doesn't always need to be a rubric, but that's a great way to be able to provide feedback. So now I'm talking, you're doing direct assessment, you're facilitating a group discussion, and if you're grading anything, you're now providing feedback. You've now accomplished 3 of the things where you only needed to do 2, which is why I say don't stress out on these guidelines so much. And so, what I have a picture here is a grading interface where Harmonize is embedded inside a Canvas. You can see on the right in SpeedGrader, you've got your rubric. That's a great way to be able to give clear feedback to the student on how they're doing. And then on the left panel, I have our picture of what it is that you're assessing. So we pull all the posts in so you can see all the work they did, all the comments they made. You can actually see how much they read as well. So if you can think about that from your reporting side, like it's not just about is the student posting and then leaving. You actually want to know, like, did that student read? Did they pay attention to what was going on in the classroom? Like imagine in a in-person classroom, if there's some student sort of staring out the window and then like they raise their hand once and make a comment and then they stare out the window again, like that's okay. They're in class, but you really want to be able to monitor that as well inside your discussion to know how much they're reading. And that's something that we like to encourage people to do. When we talk about assessing feedback, I said you're grading, but it doesn't have to be grading, right? Like you can always give feedback on any student work in any way. And in a literature class, you might comment on a Google Doc and mark it up, or you might just reply to some of their work in the discussion and give them some feedback on that. It doesn't have to be grading to be feedback. As long as it's you as the instructor communicating to the student, you've checked another one of those boxes of what the guidelines say. I have on the screen here 2 things that I think are some of the more exciting types. We actually allow you to mark up a video. So if like in sign language, they're going along, you can actually pause the video and be like, here, your hands are too far apart. Or if they have a drawing, you can actually draw on the image and be like, I didn't like what you did here with the bridge drawing as you're going along. So any type of feedback you can give checks one of those boxes, and the more feedback you can get, obviously the more involved the student is going to feel, and that's what the guidelines are really trying to drive. Like that interaction is happening in the classroom. All right. One of the other things was answering questions about the course, or just questions about whatever's happening in the class in general. We at Harmonize have a Q&A forum where you as students can actually put things in and you can flag things as the correct answer. Other students can answer them. You can chime in and be like, that was a good answer. Setting up a Q&A forum is a great way to be able to have a place dedicated to taking questions about the course. If you don't use Harmonize or you don't use another Q&A forum, you can also just do this with a discussion forum. Just set up a place that is like, hey, this is where you can throw your questions and I will monitor that. And the other students, you can answer questions there as well. It doesn't work quite as smoothly, but it's there and you can do it. So when I talk about questions for the course, if you don't want to set up a different discussion, we have a way to flag a question for the teacher so that they know, hey, student, I'm posting in the discussion, and teacher, this is a question for you. I want you to answer it. You could also do that with @mentions. You could also do that with a hashtag. It's not quite as seamless, but be giving a standard for the student so that you don't miss it. Because a lot of times as the instructors, it's crazy busy, right? Like, how am I supposed to monitor that the student has a question? Did they reach out? Where did they reach out? Did they reach out in the discussion and I missed it? Oh no. So giving them some sort of clear communication of this is how I want to receive questions, and this is how I want them to receive them publicly versus privately, and how does that go? That also checks a box for substantive interaction. And my favorite one, others is approved by the creditors. Yeah, I don't know what that means. It's kind of like the checkbox of like, let's not kill innovation. Like if you're doing something amazing, awesome. Talk to your creditors about it and see whether it checks the box or not. My guess, if you're being that innovative, that you probably already are checking the other boxes anyway, but it's a nice out to be able to do things that are perhaps more creative. One of these that pops to mind is like student facilitation. Like it's a really great tool that we support to be able to nominate a student to facilitate the discussion so they're learning from each other. Technically, that's not instructor interaction because you're taking a step back and you're letting the students do the facilitation. However, research actually shows that that type of facilitated discussion is actually more productive and better for learning in certain cases than an instructor-led one. And so we don't want to shut that down. So I'm guessing that is more where this falls into things. All right. Now I'm going to move into the more complicated part. So I spoke through that pretty quickly because I'm assuming a lot of people are kind of in the online education world and they kind of can get those top level points of I'm doing direct feedback, I'm facilitating a group discussion, I'm taking questions from the class, I'm providing feedback, I'm assessing. Those things I think make a lot of sense. Now let's get into some of the more complicated things, and this I think is where we'll spend more time, as we sort of implied in the title, is what does regular mean? And included in regular is also the requirement that you are monitoring engagement and performance, which is hard. Some people can just say, well, I know engagement when I see it, but that's not systematic monitoring. How do you know you're not leaving someone behind? How do you know that there's a quiet student or that there's a behavior change in the student that you haven't identified? Because sometimes it's easy to lose a student in the online classroom. So I'm going to start with the easier part, I guess, predictable and scheduled. If you are building your course with modules, let's say I'm going to make an example here, week by week, module by module. As long as you're thinking in that module, what kind of interaction am I looking for? Do I have a discussion forum in this? How am I taking feedback in this particular module? That I think falls into the regular guidelines. They have some pretty broad description of it's predictable and scheduled, commensurate with the length and time and the amount of content in the course. So as long as you're using an outline in that regard and you're thinking really hard about interaction, when to lace it into the course, I think you check the regular side of it in terms of the predictable and scheduled. But performance, that's also a little bit easier because it's grades and you can look in your gradebook and monitor performance. So as long as you're assessing on somewhat regular basis, you can use that as an indicator of performance. What does the grade look like? How are they doing? So you're checking the box there. The tricky one is monitoring engagement. And I think this one is so important. We at Harmonize have spent 18 months with a large team of engineers trying to solve this one. So this is the one where I'm going to spend a fair amount of time talking about. I'm going to use our tools that we've built to talk about how monitoring engagement looks, what the complexities are with it, and how to be able to even figure out how to do it. What does engagement mean? How do you determine what's good engagement versus not? All of these things, I'm going to cover some of them briefly and talk through maybe things to think about how you could do this in your classroom if you're not using our tool, but also to highlight some of the thought we've put into it. So maybe that can prime the pump as well. All right. It's monitoring performance, monitoring engagement. You can't do it seldom. Like you have to do it rather frequently. If you imagine, like if you've had a job where you get pulled in for your annual review and you're all nervous and you're like, a whole year behind me, like you have to be more proactive than that. And that's why I think the monitoring of engagement is super important, because in the data we're looking at from all of our platform, all of our tools, you can see leading indicators of, like, let's say peer engagement drops. That's often a leading indicator that other things are going to go poorly soon. But boy, if we could have told you that peer engagement was dropping and that student suddenly took a turn compared to their peers to have less performance than they did before, if we can get that to you early, like you can save that student, or maybe you can save that student. You can pull them back into the class. And it's kind of a fancy phrase, but I use it's like a formative retention tool, right? Like if the students fail the quiz, man, that hurts. And that's hard to come back from. But if you see them starting to check out, much like you would in an on-site classroom, you can be like, oh, Bobby staring out the window over there, to be able to see that happening and to pull them back in before they stop paying attention, before they fail a class, is I think what we're really after here. So what does it look like to monitor that engagement? Okay, so the approach we've taken, and this is how I'm going to walk you through it so you can think about how to monitor engagement, is that everyone in the class is trying to accomplish the same thing. They're doing the same assignments. They're doing the same homework. They're in the same facilitated discussions. However, every single course is different. So I can't stand up here and be like, engagement means 3 comments and 1 post a week, because that's meaningless in different courses. Like that might be good for some courses. It might be bad for some courses. We don't know. So you have to think about, how does the engagement activity look in my course in this point in time, based on the expectations that I have for my course in this point in time, in order to be able to tell, is the student engaged as much as I would hope they would be right now? And if that sounds complicated, it's because it is complicated. So the way we've approached this is to say, well, we're all about asynchronous discussions is our flagship product. And so there's a finite point in time where you're in this discussion topic. You as the instructor have written the prompt. The students are in there with you, and hopefully it has a due date. But even if it doesn't have a due date, all of the students start to interact and then start to fade away. And so you can look at that classroom and see like, well, is this discussion topic generating a lot of activity? Okay, well, where are my students that are below their peers? Where are my students that aren't interacting as much as the rest of the students in the class? And how do I pull those students in, because I monitored that aspect of their engagement at this point in time, and pull them back into the class? And that's what we were trying to build. So what we have is we assign a risk factor to the student based on behavior changes and based on a whole bunch of things that we've correlated to retention, to say, well, when a student falls off in this way, that is actually correlated to retention, and therefore we need to highlight that. And whether it's a low risk or a medium risk or high risk, we need to surface that up to the instructor. And it's important to say that we don't show this to the student, because you as the instructor are king or queen. You know more about your students than anyone else in the world, and specifically in relation to the topic, I should say, that you're teaching. And so, we'll surface these concerns to you, and we take this step of like, let's not make you drowned in data, because that can get tough. But how do you look and say, I want to look at their peer engagement. I want to look at their engagement with the course. I want to be able to think about these things, and I'll cover some of those things shortly and what we're looking at. And then take a look at those, the instructor, really quick, make a decision. Do I need to reach out to the student or not? Perhaps the student is not engaged, but I also happen to know they're a genius and I don't have to worry about them, and I can move on. But also, monitor engagement can also mean what is getting better and what is really good. So you don't want to just focus on the negative, because then you're coming to the student, you're being like, this is bad, this is bad, this is bad, this is bad, which they don't necessarily want to hear. You want to try like that compliment sandwich of like, your engagement in this side got better. The complexity of the content you're writing got better. However, I see you're still struggling to engage as much as your peers are. And can we talk about that? Maybe can you log in more into the class, et cetera, to be able to customize that outreach? But you as the instructor, what is it that you can be monitoring? So the way we have looked at this is we've broken it down into some basic categories, and we monitor those and lay them out on graphs for you over time so you can see. But these are the types of things you can think about. Some of the straightforward one, requirements, is what we call our multiple due date feature I had talked about, where you can actually say, I want you to post by this date, 2 comments, 6 comments by this date, and here's the final due date. But the same thing applies to a normal discussion. Like if you have a due date on the discussion and they are missing that due date, that is really strongly correlated with a problem. And so that's something you can monitor and take a look at. The next thing we look at is quantity, and that's quantity of many different types of interactions that I won't get into because you won't be able to monitor them all. There's too many of them. But the idea is, how much are they doing in the class? How much are they in there posting? How much are they in there commenting, liking, uploading images, uploading resources, critiquing videos? What kind of thing are they in there doing? And do you see someone who's not doing as much of it? Are they below their peers? And that's a good one to focus in on. And I'll take a step back for a second and point out that, like, you can see the blue line about dropping down to bottoming out like maybe a third of the way across this graph. That's the type of thing you're looking for when you're talking about these particular items. Like, this is a student who stopped meeting their deadlines 2/3 of the way through the class. The instructor ended up reaching out to them, and this is not a real student, so don't worry that I'm showing real student data, but the instructor would reach out to the student, and then that starts to come back online. They start to meet those deadlines again. So they saved the student by seeing that early before they actually failed something. The other types of things you can think about, timing. Timing's a huge one, but timing's complicated, and I'm going to say I wouldn't necessarily recommend that you try to dig too deeply into this, other than if it's a student that only always comes in at the last second. That's something you can focus on, because if they are doing that, they're actually not reading everything that's going on. They don't have time to get responses back to what's going on to their content, and therefore they're not going to have as much peer engagement. All of those things can relate to timing. We monitor it more subtly than that, of like, is there a behavior change? Did the student used to be early and they started to drift later? Types of things like that. But without machine learning, without artificial intelligence, I don't think you're going to accomplish that. But the thing you can focus on there when you're talking about monitoring engagement is, if they're always there a minute before close, they're never getting feedback from me. They're never getting feedback from their fellow students. That's not a great learning experience. So that's something you can monitor. The next one, I'm going to cover content. Like, if they're posting in an asynchronous discussion and they're always like, "Good job, I agree, yes, that's great," or their writing is more texting style versus academic style, or whatever it is that you deem is appropriate for your class. If their content is not great, then that's something that you could reach out to them and talk about. And that's going to be less of a data monitoring tool for you. That'll just be, reading what they're doing and seeing how does it look. And the final one that I'll bring up because we cover it and it's super important, but I don't know how you would monitor this without our tools, because this one was one of the harder ones to get at, is peer connectedness. What is the graph of connectivity of this student related to the other students? How many students are they connected to? How strongly are they connected to those other students? I don't know of a way to monitor this without doing a lot of data science, which is what we had to do to accomplish this. So maybe that's one that, if you're not using our tools, you can sort of let slide. Or if you're lucky enough that you have a great data science department at your institution, they could dive in and help you figure that one out. Wanted to highlight, when we are narrowing down to look at something, we also want to be able to have the context of what was going on in the class at that time. This is something I think that whenever you're looking at data, you need to be cognizant of. So it's not just perhaps that the student is something that's happened in their life. It's also the context of, like, well, what was I teaching at that time? And is maybe that related somehow? So we make sure and we give that context in the graphs. Make sure it's something that you pay attention to. So if you're looking at they dropped off, it may not just be that they are having a bad week. Might be. It might be that there's something in the content that they're confused on that they could use some help with, or any number of things. So make sure you understand the context of what's in your class when you're trying to monitor engagement. All right, I ran through that and I wanted to leave some time for questions. I'm not sure that there will be many, because we're pretty close to the holidays. But if there are, I'm happy to take them, because I know we're heading into winter break a little bit.
Yeah, Marcus, I appreciate it so much. I think it's very refreshing when I think Instructure, I was customer before I became part of the team, but I think it's really refreshing as educators to look at companies like Harmonize by 42 and Instructure, just the fact and the care that we take into making sure that a lot of the things are educator focused and student focused. And every time I see a presentation that comes across like this, like how to increase engagement, if it's not rooted in what our educators are doing and how they're doing it, and
Right.
how our students are interacting, and what's kind of going to best play out, however your district defines that, for engagement, like, then why are you doing it? Right? Like,
Right.
is it a money grab? Is it what is there out there? And I think we've done a good job, and I love, seeing the work that you guys are doing there as well, because you have rooted it in educators and students' success. So I love that.
Yeah, we're doing lots of artificial intelligence here, and people often balk at that because they're like, "You're not trying to replace the instructor." We're like, "No, machines are kind of dumb."
Yeah.
So you're never going to replace the instructor. But how do we use artificial intelligence to support the instructor? Like,
Yeah.
I never want an AI bot talking to my students. Like, ugh, yuck.
No.
Like, and the students will know. The students will be like, "No, I don't want that."
Yeah.
But if you can use that to sort of do all of the hard work for the instructor, of like, instructors don't want to be digging through data and trying to read the tea leaves of what's going on. So it's like, how do we make that easier for the instructor to be able to accomplish that?
Yeah, I love to hear that. So we have a ton of stuff in the comments and chat section, which is probably why we don't have a lot of questions. We've probably answered them in these links, which you guys have provided. Absolutely fantastic. I have an online instructors guide. Then you can schedule, it looks like here, you can schedule a 15-minute chat and you'll get a $15 Starbucks gift card. Let's
True.
go.
I should have covered that. Yeah, so I mean, I love Harmonize. It's my life's ambition, right? And if you saw something you liked there and you just want to get more information or see a demo of it or talk about it, like, we love to have those conversations. We value what we learn in those conversations, because even if you don't end up buying Harmonize, like, you inevitably tell us something and we're like, oh, good point, and hence the $15 gift card. Like, there's no obligation there. It's just we love to have conversations with people. That's how we learn, because what instructors tell us makes us go, good point.
Marcus, we have filibustered enough that we have a comment here from Dave. What, in your opinion, has caused this new RSI focus? Is it increased in online offerings, or perhaps more students taking online courses but not doing well?
I would have, if I were just looking at the release date. So this came out the final guidelines came out, I think, in August of this year. And so you would think COVID driven, right? But things don't move that quickly. So this started before COVID, in terms of them trying to get a handle on what is going on. So it's been a multi-year process of them doing panels and trying to figure out what is the best thing going on in online education. I think it's probably driven just by student retention rates, would be my guess, in terms of online education. Like, it is really harder to keep a student retained. And when the accrediting bodies come out and they look at retention rates at school, they're like, online education retention rates are not great. And then when they look at the schools, they're like, well, no one really has a standards that we are enforcing for them to do it. And so that is my guess, is that it's just been a long time coming as online education grows. And luckily, it happens to come in a time where, luckily, depending on how you feel about federal guidelines, luckily it lines up now in a time where suddenly there was this massive acceleration into online education. So I think we didn't build the tools we were building because of the RSI guidelines. We built them because we felt they were lacking and needed in the world, in the space. They just happened to line up with the guidelines, which happened to line up with COVID, which happens to line up with a whole bunch of more people having to take classes online. So I wish I had a better answer as to who in the room was like, you know what we should do, but it definitely doesn't seem to be COVID related. It's been a long time coming. So.
Yeah, well, I appreciate that. Thank you so much for the insights. And again, if you want to get a hold of Harmonize, if you'd like to see more or learn more about the product, all of those links are in the comments and chat section below. Thank you so much to Harmonize by 42 Lines. I didn't screw that up. I don't even have that written out. The long name was going to catch me at some point. I knew it was, but I'm going to pat myself on the back that we didn't screw that typically.
Well done, Eddie. Well done.
That could really, get this thing off the rails. We appreciate you so much. Thank you for sharing your passion and this product with us, and for partnering with Instructure. And we can't wait to see what happens next. And again, if you have questions or comments, like, share, do all of the things, ring the bell so you get more notifications on these platforms. Thank you so much for being a part of today's live stream.
Take care, everybody.